Welcome to Wednesday night online Bible study for June 16th, 2021. Tonight the title for my Eyewitness Bible study is Wise King, Foolish King. It will be an entire session dedicated to Solomon. I had originally planned to record this in room 11 and have the screen behind me and go through all the verses, but that's going to take a really, really long time, and there are probably more efficient things that I could be doing. If you have your Bible with you, and I suggest you do, you're going to want to find Deuteronomy 17, and let me just suggest that you should see that one coming. It keeps recurring anytime you look at the kings and the prophets. 1 Kings chapter 10, 1 Kings chapter 5, 1 Kings chapter 9, and Leviticus 25. Those will be the key verses that will be centered around in kind of a survey of Solomon's experience. We'll hear from Solomon, or obviously an actor playing King Solomon, and this will be our one foray into King Solomon. But the consequences of King Solomon go on and on and on and on in the biblical text. If I ask the average person, whether they were a Jesus follower or not a Jesus follower, whatever they were, what is your view of Solomon? And you probably would come up with a few things. One, you'll probably tell me that he's a really, really wise king. He asked for wisdom and God gave him wisdom and all these different things, and we could go into how that happened and didn't happen. But yes, you'd be correct. You would probably tell me the narrative of the splitting the baby narrative. A phrase that in some cultures still lives on today. About solving a problem, you split the baby. A horrible phrase, but a solution that wise King Solomon did. Now, some events that he'll describe before he asked for wisdom that are traumatic, and the realistic part, because as I repeat over and over again, and I know it's a quote that occurs in movies in medieval times and even in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it is difficult for a good man, or I want to add a good woman, to be king. Because it is difficult for you to juggle what is right for the nation and what is moral, because those often come into conflict. Let me just introduce you to the important text for today, and it's Deuteronomy 17, starting at verse 14. And if this fails to sound familiar, you should go back to the previous sessions that will, as celebrity pastors say often, as long as there is the internet, these will be online. This is from Deuteronomy. It's presented as kind of the last words of Moses. We have great reason to believe that it was written down. I'm not arguing whether Moses said this or not, but it was written down significantly after King Solomon and King David. I'm not trying to refute the truth of that and why it was and how it was written. I'm just trying to say that it clearly was written down after that period of time. Deuteronomy 17, verse 14, depending on how you want to view this text, it is incredibly prophetic for the rest of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. The writer of Deuteronomy wants us to see Moses preaching this, and says, when you enter the land, verse 14, the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Now, just to clarify, other nations did have kings at the time that Moses was describing. They may have called them pharaohs, they may have called them other things, but they were kings. But this had never happened, and doesn't happen for quite a while in Israel's history. It says, verse 15, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not take a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. Verse 16, the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get any more of them, for the Lord has told you. You are not to go back that way again. Verse 17, he must not take many wives. Now remember, this is important. We talked about this with David. It doesn't forbid the taking of more than one wife, but many wives. And I'm doing this part from memory, so if I'm wrong, I apologize. I believe David had possibly 8 wives. Maybe that's not too many, maybe it is. I'm not trying to debate their culture and their experience and things they had. But we're pretty sure Solomon had too many. And that's going to be a problem. But verse 17, repeating, says, he must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. I'm not trying to argue with you when this was written, how it was written and when it was first said. I did present to you that it was written after the time of the kingdoms. But you could see why a lot of people would read this section and go, this sounds like they're just reporting, they're not prophesying. I'm not trying to argue that one way or the other. I just want you to understand that in the Torah, even your most strict, rigid Jewish person would see this as very, very important. Just so we're clear, it was very common practice in all cultures to have more than one wife. It was done for treaties and intermingling and all those things you've learned if you experience all the period medieval things and of, you must marry this one and just go back to your history of Europe. You should know that. David clearly took up to 8 wives. Solomon, he has a whole lot more. And I'll let him describe that for you. I know these are out of order and we're jumping around. I'm just trying to give you context to what Solomon's going to say. 1 Kings chapter 10. So I'll give you a little time to flip your biblical text to get to 1 Kings chapter 10 or use your Bible app. This is describing Solomon, and he is at the height of his reign as king. It is the height. It is the most power that he has. It's chronologically, it's 1 Kings chapter 10 here. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 23. It says, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom he had put in his heart. God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone would come and brought a gift. Articles of silver and gold and robe and weapons and spices and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothill. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Q. It's K-U-E if you're reading it. The royal merchants purchased them at Q at a certain price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 6,000 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the Arameans. That's exactly what Deuteronomy said not to do. And I'm not trying to argue predicting or just reporting. They knew not to do that, and Solomon did it. Now, to take us back in your biblical text, if you're reading out a biblical text, just some background. 1 Kings chapter 5. This is early on. This is not long after in their chronology of the split the baby event, and they're trying. And then after that, someone who was a frenemy of David comes to Solomon seeking help and hoping that he'll be safe under Solomon's reign. And Solomon uses opportunity to gain all the materials he needs to build the temple, which David had been told by God his son will be allowed to do that. This is how Solomon does it, and this is what starts the problem. So if you want to take this as religion is the problem, but when we take it too far and we do things and we institute practices and we think we can force our religion on others, ding, ding, ding. 1 Kings chapter 5. We'll start with verse 13 because I don't want to read all of this because you can read it yourself. It says, King Solomon conscripted, and conscripted means exactly what you think it means. Drafted them, forced them, did not give them a choice. Laborers from all of Israel, 30,000 men. Now, as we're going to read on, it's going to sound contradictory to what Leviticus says to do. It wasn't, but it was stretching the rules. 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 14. He said he sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 8,000 stonecutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervised the project and directed the workers. This was a major building program. At the king's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide the foundation of the dressed stone for the temple. Now, a little later on, we get to chapter 9. And we see that conscription and using slaves became really, really important. And if the video doesn't, I'm going to assume that you won't get enough of the information from the video. I'm going to add some of that at the end. But let me just read from 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 20 through 22. This is just setting the context for your video. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 20 reads, "There were still people left from the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. These people were not technically Israelites. Solomon conscripted the descendants of all these people remaining in the land, whom the Israelites could not exterminate, to serve as slave labor, as it is to this day," as it was to the day that 1 Kings was written down. "But Solomon did not make any slaves of the Israelites." He didn't make them slaves. He made them paid force workers. They were his fighting men, his government officials, his officers, his captains, and his commanders of the chariots and the charioteers. Why am I splitting hairs on that issue? Because of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 25. We're going to start at verse 44. Remember, I'm trying to not overemphasize this. The first 5 books of the Bible are considered to be the most significant to Jewish people. They were considered most significant. When this was written, when these events are occurring and people are reflecting upon this later, they're reflecting upon it based on Genesis and Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Mostly Deuteronomy. But Leviticus factors in. Leviticus chapter 25 verse 44 reads, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves." Now we could sit here and argue I thought God was against slavery. As with many things, and this is a social justice issue and a social issue discussion, God has seemed to have historically allowed us to do things not the best way until we were ready to do it a better way. Think polygamy. Why does God allow polygamy to exist? Why did that happen when God seemed to be against it from the beginning? Because God's giving us a chance to do things until we are ready. Why does Paul not proclaim in his epistles that slavery is evil? Because he can't visualize a time period in which slavery would not exist. If you'd like to apply that to some other social issues, that's fine. Feel free to discuss that, put that in comments, send something to me. I'm just trying to present the important data for you for this presentation, which is rather well done. Leviticus 25 verse 45, it says, "You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clan born in your country, and they will become your property." And this is very carefully coded language that anybody you can't see as purebred Israelites, you can conscript them as slaves. Spoiler, the king gets to decide who's purebred. Yeah. "You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly." You must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. I will come back to that after the video presentation just to fill in some gaps. Because the fact that Solomon screws this up is why he is the worst king and one of the worst leaders ever over Israel. Ever. And if you feel I have ruined your view of Solomon, just wait, I'll be back. Let me let Solomon talk to you.
When I started, I was the best king of Israel. By the time I finished, I was the worst king of Israel. Every Jew who has ever lived should spit in disgust at the sound of my name. My name is King Solomon, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about me.
King Solomon has long had a reputation for being the wisest man who ever lived. Unfortunately, he foolishly led his country into the worship of false gods and away from the worship of the one true God.
One of the most dangerous things any monarchy can do is make it unclear as to who will succeed its leaders upon their death. You're probably used to thinking that a king's firstborn son is always the successor. In my time, no such rule had been established, so the position was up for grabs as King David aged, and there were a lot of people interested in the final results. My father, King David, had at least 20 sons by his many wives and concubines. His firstborn son, Amnon, was murdered by his third son, Absalom. Absalom was killed during the rebellion against King David. There is little record of the second son, so it is presumed he died at a young age. That left the fourth son, Adonijah, in line by age. Although Adonijah tried to claim the throne, King David put an end to his efforts and named me as successor. I am the second son of David by his wife Bathsheba. Bathsheba's first son died as a young infant as God's punishment for David's committing adultery with her and for murdering her first husband Uriah. Although David had promised Bathsheba that I would succeed him, it is unclear whether that was God's preferred choice or my mother using her good looks and charm. However, I did succeed David when he crowned me as king shortly before he passed away, after ruling Israel for 40 years. There was the proverbial good news and bad news awaiting me as king. I had to deal harshly with 3 people. The pretender to the throne, my half-brother Adonijah, was given leniency by me, but broke the rules, and I executed him. The commander of David's army, Joab, conspired with Adonijah and had to be punished for his past crimes, so I had him put to death. Shimei, who had insulted my father while he was fleeing from Absalom, also chose to disregard the rules of his probation, and I had him put to death. Overall, the good news was that my father had thoroughly subjugated the enemies of Israel and all the surrounding countries. Our country was at peace, and tributes and treasures flowed into our country, so we were very, very wealthy. Another outstanding piece of good news was that my father had amassed a huge amount of treasure that would easily allow me to build a fabulous temple for God and an extravagant palace for myself. It took me 7 years to build the temple, but almost twice as long to build my palace. My kingship started out on a very good foundation. In a dream, God told me that I could have anything I wanted. I ask only for his wisdom in governing God's people. God was so pleased with this unselfish request that he granted me great wisdom and great riches. I finished building the temple and palace, and the Lord appeared to me a second time. He told me that he had consecrated the temple and that his name, his eyes and heart would be there forever. That promise was conditional. God also told me that if I walked before him with integrity and obedience, that my line would be established forever. If I or my descendants chose to turn away from God and not be obedient, he would cut off the Israelites from the land and reject the temple. Simple, right? All my descendants and I had to do was walk with integrity and obedience to God. I started doing so with the best of intentions. My wisdom became the stuff of legends. I was the wisest person in the world. I was capable of talking about any subject. People of all nations came to listen to my wisdom. Most people know the story of me finding the true mother of a baby by threatening to cut it in half. Most people know that I had more knowledge than any other man of my time. People from all over the world came to listen to me, including the Queen of Sheba. But even in my wisdom, it was not enough to protect me from my riches. My first use of riches was to build God's temple and all its furnishings. And God was very happy with the results of building his house. He might not have been quite so happy that I spent so much on my own house. After that, I just kept amassing wealth as it flowed in. Hundreds of years before my time, Moses had commanded that when Israel had a king, he must not acquire a great number of horses, especially from Egypt, not take many wives, or his heart would be led astray, and not accumulate large amounts of silver or gold. I clearly violated the third of those commands by accumulating large amounts of silver and gold. In fact, silver was so common under my command that it was considered common stone. That excess of wealth might have been excused because God had granted it to me in a blessing. But one of my first uses for my wealth was to accumulate a great number of horses, especially the really fine horses from Egypt. I had 12,000 horses. So many that I created special cities in which to house them and my chariots. As you can guess, this not only cost a huge amount of money to upkeep, but it started turning my trust from God to trusting in my own army. I should have known better. My father David did the same thing when he ordered a census to count his fighting men. And God got so angry that he sent a plague to Israel that killed 70,000 people. I made God even more angry than my father. But God did not react as quickly. Worse than any of those things, though, I started accumulating many wives. How many? My father David had at least 8 wives. I had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. My wives and concubines came from many countries and worshiped many gods. Through them, my heart was turned from the true God to many false gods. Since my wives were of royal birth, they were obviously from different countries and different races. This violated God's decree that we Jews not intermarry with other races. So why? Why did I marry so many wives of royal birth? In my wisdom, I was sure that marrying them was a diplomatic way of having peace treaties with all these countries. Rather than follow my father's example of trusting God and having a powerful army, I decided to trust in my own diplomatic skills. This would turn out to be disastrous for Israel. My wives influenced me greatly, but it was I who chose to turn my heart from the true God. I didn't just barely turn away from God, but I did it with fervor. I followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. I followed Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And on a hill east of Jerusalem, I even built a high place for Moloch and for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, who required detestable types of sacrifice. I did these sorts of things for all my wives, though against what I knew was right. My heart turned completely from God. That is why I was the worst king of Israel. I introduced worship of false gods to the Israelites so powerfully that they never fully recovered. I violated the terms of the deal I had made with God in my second vision. And because I turned away from God, he punished me and my people as he said he would. He was intent that we would turn from our wicked ways and become his people. I knew the drill. As I once wrote, don't fail to discipline your child. The rod of punishment won't kill him. God determined that the kingdom would be partially torn away from the line of my family, and he raised up adversaries to my rule, both internally and externally. One of those adversaries was Hadad the Edomite. He and his raiders were a constant torment to my rule from Edom. Another adversary was Rezon from Damascus. He and his men were a constant menace to my rule from the country of Aram. It may sound like Hadad and Rezon were not that big of a deal. They only controlled a small portion of the land in my empire. However, the portion that they controlled was over parts of the important trade routes known as the King's Highway, or the Via Maris. They had the capability to disrupt trade and to keep my military busy. However, they were not my biggest problem. I had massive public works projects as I tried to fortify and grow my kingdom. In order to accomplish those projects, I made slaves of many foreigners and conscripted Israelites. And one of the young men who helped manage a project was Jeroboam, He was so diligent that I put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. One day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, he was met by Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh. Shiloh had lost its importance because it no longer housed the Ark of the Covenant, but it continued to be the home of prophets and priests. Ahijah told Jeroboam that God was going to split Israel into 2 pieces. One piece would have 10 tribes and be led by Jeroboam, while the other piece would only have 1 tribe and be led by my descendants. The tribe of Levi, the priest, would be split between the 2. The split was to occur after my death. Like me, Jeroboam was instructed to be faithful to God and to follow his commandments, or Jeroboam and his descendants would lose their kingdom too. When I found out about Ahijah's prophecy, I tried to kill Jeroboam, but he fled Egypt and stayed out of my reach. However, he was a constant reminder that my days were numbered and that God was going to punish me and my descendants for my unfaithfulness. You may have noticed that there is no prophet associated with my story. I did not have a prophet to help keep me in line. I thought I was so wise I would guide myself. The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their own perversity. I did not listen to my own proverb. Many people consider my rule to be the golden age of Israel. We dominated the countries around us. There were no major empires that threatened us, and we were at peace. We had a new, fabulous temple that was finer than anything any other country had created for their gods. My palace was extravagant beyond belief. Our country was in an economic boom, and we had massive public works projects that would make life much better for the Israelites. The whole world envied Israel and me. But we were a house built upon sand. The high costs of my excessive lifestyle led to higher and higher taxes, and to me forcing people into virtual slavery. Some of the enemies that my father had dominated were growing in strength. Many Israelites were led by me into idolatry and no longer worshiped God. When I became king, Israel was at its zenith. When I died, after 40 years of rule, the kingdom was falling off a precipice into destruction because of my many mistakes. King Solomon. That is why all Jews who ever lived should spit at the sound of my name.
Okay, just to clarify, in case you missed it the first time, Solomon's a terrible king. From a sociological standpoint, from a long-term planning standpoint, from a projection standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, from every sense of way to judge a king, he's the worst. Now I know from reading ahead we're going to hear about King Ahab, we're going to hear about all kinds of horrible kings in the future. Solomon is the worst. But he had the most resources, he had the most wisdom, and he had every possible advantage was given to him by David and by God. Pieces that we miss. We get into this, well, your heart swayed because of your different wives that you married and crossed and all those things. Great, let's discuss that from a practical standpoint. When you, and this was done everywhere, when you bring a new wife from another country, even if you're saving her from that country, whatever way you rationalize that, because there were ways to do that and still follow the Israelite code. When you bring a wife from another country, you create an area in your country that looks like her country. This is a terrible analogy, but I've used this with some of your teenagers and the children. We were doing after Sunday events. It seems so long ago when we were doing that. Talking about Solomon and listening to your friends, which will be, I will repeat how you often should listen to your friends in 2 sessions from tonight. Solomon, everyone he would bring in, every queen he would bring in, he has to create everything that was there for him, or a resemblance of it. Bad analogy, I'm sorry for this. He has to create. If she was from Persia, he has to create a little Persia. And when I've taught this in other places, I've said, okay, and if she had the greatest shopping mall in the world where she lived, you have to create at least a mini version of that. And you have to create everything that she's used to for that. Now, even if you think I'm exaggerating, he has to do that as a part of the treaty. Now, I'd like you to consider he has 700 wives, not in dispute. I'm not even going to discuss his 300 concubines. So he has 700 wives that he brings in. And we make this big deal of they swayed his heart from his love for God. True. But that's not the major damage they do, as damaging as that is. The economy and the society of Israel is destroyed because Solomon must keep those people who are conscripted from building the temple. Well, it was okay, God, for me to use it for the temple. Then it's okay, God, for me to use it for this wife, and this wife, and this wife. And he turns a majority of the people in Israel into slaves. He pays them so they're not slaves, but they don't have a choice. Anyone who was not pure Israelite was a slave, and they were forced to build palaces and, for my analogy, shopping areas and entertainment centers for the queens, while they went back home to their tiny, poor place. You want to know how to create civil unrest? That's a good way. Not to spoil it, since we're going to spend some time in the wisdom literature next week, but the names Rehoboam and Jeroboam will be very important in 2 weeks. And one of them is a direct descendant of Solomon who learns from Solomon how to be a horrible king. And it destroys what could have been an incredible kingdom. The consequences of decisions that we learn from Solomon is when decisions that you make now that seem okay in the short term, when you stack them up in the long term, they may have cataclysmic consequences. They did. Solomon is the reason for the divided kingdom. Solomon is the reason the Assyrians come in and destroy. Solomon is the reason the Babylonians come in. It's all Solomon's fault. Now, Rehoboam, as we'll hear about in 2 weeks, could have made a different decision, but based on what he had seen from Solomon, there is no reason to think that he would have made that decision. So we'll call it 2 generations. I'm exaggerating a little bit. Within 2 generations, Israel is the greatest power it has ever been under David. And within 2 generations, it is split. God told us to use our brain. Solomon was given all the wisdom possible, but he didn't use his wisdom for long term. He only used it for short term at a certain point, and it destroys the kingdom. The classic biblical principle here is, what short-term decisions are you making now that you could change for the better in the long term? What are the spiritual ones you can make? What are the practical ones you can make? What are the ones that you're setting an example for your descendants? What can you do? If that sounds harsh, that is how Solomon has been taught in Jewish tradition for so long. We have romanticized him into a really wise king, which he was. But just because he was wise doesn't mean he did the right thing. Unfortunately, that's where we have to end this Bible study, so I apologize for it being oh my goodness, that's not what I wanted to hear tonight. I get that. That's the beauty of the Bible. You should read it. It's amazing what's in there. Let me close in prayer, if just for me, to try to ponder more my short-term decisions versus long-term decisions. And then next week we'll look at wisdom literature, which is usually attributed to Solomon. In many cases, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We can talk about that next week. Let's pray. Holy God, thank you for real people who wrote down real words of real events that happened as they tried to deal with their faith and process their faith and figure out what to do and how to do it. And thank you that we can learn from their examples, good and bad. And thank you that you have always been working, and you have always been working in spite of our weakness, working in spite of our inability to change. And you have been making great efforts to reach out to us in so many ways. Thank you for living and dying and rising from the dead so that my life can be better and that I can help others for their lives to be better too. Help me not to be the bad example that Solomon was. Help me not to be the reason for so many problems later. Help me to be a good citizen in your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everyone. Next week will be wisdom literature. I'm sure I'll make the joke about wisdom literature is the fortune cookies of the Bible. And then in 2 weeks, we'll come back to a little more serious of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Thank you so much for being a part of this, and we'll see you next time.